So in line with the theme of this conference on the changing character of war and peace, I thought that I would like to try out some ideas on a new research project I've been working on, which actually draws upon some of the work I have already published in Professor Porrick O'Malley's journal, New England Journal of Public Policy last year, and I presented last year on Cyber. So this is this new project on indirect strategy is an attempt to synthesize some of these ideas further and to sort of like get feedback from all of you on how you guys think how viable this project would be. So to start off, I mean, we have all heard about how we are currently in the era of hybrid warfare, right? And there have been many definitions, as some of us here would know, of hybrid warfare, right? So for example, one well-known definition from the US military is hybrid warfare is the diverse and dynamic combination of regular forces, irregular forces, and or criminal elements, all unified to achieve mutually benefiting effects. EU and NATO have also looked at the issue of hybrid warfare, which in this particular case they interpret as the methods and tools used by individual state or non-state actors to enhance their own interests, strategies and goals. And hybrid warfare can involve a continuum or spectrum of instruments of power, various elements including disinformation to disruption of energy supply, cyber war, and traditional warfare. So this continuum has prompted a lot of analysts to suggest that hybrid warfare has kind of blurred the line between war and peace, right? So what I like to suggest is perhaps if we take a few steps back and try to conceptualize what do we really mean by hybrid warfare, what is the essence of hybrid warfare, and I would suggest that the one useful way, potentially useful way to think about the issue is hybrid warfare is a kind of indirect strategy. So what do I mean? The 19th century Prussian philosopher of war, Clausewitz, noted that, very famously, he noted that war can be considered as the continuation of politics by other means. That is, war is an instrument of an intervening state to impose its will on a target state, to change the target state's behavior in ways that are consistent with what the intervening state wants, right? Except in this particular case, it's war, conflict, the force of arms, right? So today we are all aware of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you can see how the various instruments of power have been implemented against Russia for its intervention. Various instruments of power, including diplomacy, economic policy, like sanctions especially, military aid, of course, to the Ukrainian military, and strategic information operations. So to sort of like simplify that, the US military has for many, I use the US military approach of DIME, D-I-M-E, which I think is very useful. It's a very parsimonious way of summarizing the instruments of power, right? Diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. DIME, very, very easy to remember. So when we talk about how should DIME be applied, right? How should the instruments of power, whether it's diplomatic, informational, military, economic, how should it be applied, right? We can think about whether or not a DIME is being applied in a direct way or in an indirect way. So, and this gentleman there is quite well known, I would imagine, in the military studies sphere, Andre Beaufre, French strategist, and he's written about this, the whole issue of indirect strategy, and he argued that in the direct mode, that is in direct strategy, the military plays a preponderant role, the main role, but in the indirect mode, military force plays a secondary role. So Beaufre observed that during the Cold War environment of nuclear deterrence, right, the indirect strategy was very important because people wanted to avoid all-out nuclear war, right? So the indirect strategy was more important, and and this was expressed through, for example, Cold War, propaganda operations, proxy wars, but never direct conflict between the superpowers. And indirect strategy, many analysts would argue, has only increased in importance since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what's the essence of indirect strategy? And I apologize if this is a bit small, but I'll let you know what it is. Indirect strategy goes further back than Beaufre. I mean, you can go all the way back to classical sources such as the well-known Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, right? The 5th century BC. His Art of War, that's the cover of a famous book. So the essence of indirect strategy is you always avoid the enemy's strength and you bypass the enemy's strength and you undermine his weakness instead, right? You bypass the enemy's strength and undermine his weakness instead. So the best strategy, Sun Tzu argued, was that, I mean, he called it the acme of skill is to win without fighting. That is the ultimate, right? So if an intervening state, right, can impose its will on a target state without excessively relying on military power as the main instrument to impose one's will on a target state, that is, Sun Tzu would say, the acme of skill, right? So if you apply this kind of thinking to hybrid war, you could argue potentially that hybrid warfare is a kind of indirect strategy, deliberately bypassing target states' mass military strength and targeting its weaknesses instead. So how do we visualize this concept of hybrid war as an indirect strategy in today's terms, right? I mean, there's a lot of literature out there, and there's a lot of interest in what, for example, Russian strategists and Chinese strategists think. So, for example, Russia has been known to engage in new generation warfare. They call it new generation warfare, that seeks to avoid direct military confrontation with the West, seeking rather to disrupt, divide, and weaken societies regarded as competitors. So Russian strategists, and they publish this, they have argued that the very rules of war have evolved and that non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals have become more important and potentially even more important than military power itself. On the other hand, Chinese military strategists, especially since 1999, have argued that modern war has evolved to using all means, including armed force or non-armed force, military and non-military, and to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. So the Chinese have argued that, apart from the military battlefield, there are potentially other battlefields as well: environmental warfare, financial warfare, trade, cultural, legal. So to me, when I analyze all these interpretations, what seems to me, what both the Chinese and the Russian strategies are saying is that essentially it's the same thing. Avoid a powerful adversary's military strength, bypass that and attack its weakness instead. This is the essence of indirect strategy. So what would it look like? To give 3 examples, right? I would say that indirect strategy has already been applied in 3 domains at least 3 domains: cyber, telecommunications, social media. If you look at the cyber domain, right, the number of analysts have mentioned how the expansion of internet connectivity has rendered national critical infrastructure such as water, electricity, communications, and our most private information vulnerable to cyber attacks, right? So some analysts would argue that some states use cyber means to, bypass target state military power and instead get access to their critical information systems and access, delete, and manipulate the data. So analysts I can think of, for example, Jacob Hellberg in the US, he talks about how he would call, data is the new oil, right? Data is the new oil. And information, the most contested geopolitical resource sought after by many states. And so he argues, people like him argue that the strategic significance of data and information is increasingly stretching beyond the realm of intelligence collection and into the realm of political influence and control. So data is becoming the new oil. If you can bypass the target state's military strength and undermine its data, right, its data repositories, you are engaging in good indirect strategy, right? In fact, there are some other analysts, I think Halberg is one of them as well, but the others, who also talk about, how some states are also trying to seek greater manufacturing and technical dominance of the back-end architecture of the global internet. So, for example, Halberg says that if you can capture control of the core layer of the internet, right, you can control everything. You can dominate other states non-kinetically. So we see this, for example, in things that are going on, contestations that are going on every day. For example, US-Chinese competition for control of the undersea cable infrastructure that carries the bulk of global internet traffic. It's quite interesting contestation going on there. US-China-Russian competition for dominance of the space-based satellite network, because space-based satellite networks are important for the operation of transport, power, banking, communication systems, right? In addition, some states, by learning how to command and manipulate the social media space in the target state through, for example, disinformation operations, those kind of campaigns, can foster political and social polarization within the target state without a shot being fired kinetically. Again, this would be, to me, a good example of indirect strategy, right? So what are the implications of the indirect strategy moment? Well, I think I suggest, it might be useful to think in terms of indirect strategy when we scan global headlines, right? I'll give you some examples. Many analysts have talked about US-Chinese strategic competition for control of the supply chains, manufacturing supply chains for semiconductors or chips, microchips, right? That are vital for everything from artificial intelligence to cell phones. And recently there's a new book by a guy called Chris Miller who talks about chip war. And Jacob Halberg talks about how data is the new oil. Chris Miller talks about how microchips are the new oil, right? So, there's very, very interesting discussions going on now. Another example, this is quite interesting. Some analysts are talking about how we should also pay attention to what some call adversarial foreign direct investment, which is essentially foreign investments in new and emerging technologies or financially vulnerable companies in the target state, right? Because if foreign investors are able to control strategic industries within the target state, that's a kind of dominance indirectly as well, right? Example 3, some analysts are also talking about how the US and China are trying to compete for domination of the global rare earth metals market. And these rare earth metals, many names I can't really pronounce, but they're important. They are very significant for making, for example, the magnets in America's most advanced commercial military technologies, from electric vehicles to Virginia-class attack submarines. So what's the point, right? What's the point? A state that dominates such strategically critical industries and supply chains can gradually impose its geopolitical will and undermine its adversaries, whoever the adversaries are, without the need for direct military confrontation. So this is, to me, the essence of longer-term indirect strategy in action. So what are the implications of the indirect strategy moment? Again, a few more examples. There have been reports. How else is indirect strategy manifested? You can see around the world, right? For example, it's been reported that Chinese maritime vessels have been deliberately cutting underwater internet cables linking Matsu Island to the main island of Taiwan, essentially to compromise Taiwan's internal communications. Again, undermining, an example of one state undermining another state without direct military confrontation, right? And that's indirect strategy. Russia, many analysts have talked about how Russia, through its wheat exports, because it's a very significant exporter of wheat, could weaponize wheat exports as well and undermine its strategic competitors if we should decide to. So food could be weaponized as a kind of indirect strategy, right? As far as where I come from, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, there have been reports that Chinese state-backed hackers have been very active, targeting government military targets within Southeast Asia, countries belonging to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN, to exfiltrate sensitive information. Again, this is an example of indirect strategy. And a number of analysts have also talked about how Russian state-backed social media manipulation of existing socio-political fault lines in certain countries have also enabled them to destabilize some of these countries. And again, this is an example of indirect strategy in action. The whole upshot of all these examples is avoid strength, attack and undermine weakness, the essence of indirect strategy. So to conclude, I think, and it's my view, is there should be greater awareness of the indirect strategy moment in international security affairs. I call it indirect strategy moment. So at a minimum, I think it behooves all of us in the analysis community to better understand how a state's vulnerabilities at the very least, the cyber, telecommunications, and social media spaces could be undermined, right? We need to understand the vulnerabilities and develop a suite of policy responses to strengthen those vulnerabilities, right? Well, international cooperation amongst like-minded states is also probably a good idea to better identify, deter, and possibly counter hostile actor indirect strategic operations as needed. There's no such thing as war or peace. Both coexist always, right? And which brings me to George C. Marshall's advice, which he uttered after World War II, but I think it's still relevant today, right? The price of peace is eternal vigilance, right? And of course, one of my favorite quotations to end off, Trotsky, you may not be interested in war, but war is certainly interested in you. Yep. For colleagues online, 2 questions, very good questions. Why do I use the term indirect strategy for some of the examples I've used, right? That's the first question. Second question is, in the case of Israeli military operations, limited military operations in targets on Syria or Lebanon, would that constitute indirect strategy or direct strategy because military force is used? Okay, for the first question, in terms of why do I mention all these instruments of national power, the use of them as indirect? Because I'm following the definition of Andre Beaufre. So Beaufre's argument is that you have direct strategy and indirect strategy. In the direct mode of operations, military force is predominant. It is the main means by which you are seeking to impose your will on the target state, right? Everything else, economic, diplomatic, is subsidiary and supportive of the main effort, which is military force, right? So in these examples, if a state seeks to, buy or set up the telecommunications infrastructure of the target state and undermine that state from within, that to me is pretty indirect, right? Because you are bypassing military, there's no shots fired. You're beginning to try to impose control through various means rather than military. So that's how I would interpret indirect and direct, the role and importance of force. So if you talk about the Israeli interventions in places like Syria and Lebanon, my thinking is that they should be considered indirect because, as far as I can see, military interventions are not the only instrument of policy being applied by Israel in these 2 cases. There are a suite of other policies as well in other fields, right? Military force is not the primary instrument being applied to achieve objectives in this case. So to me, that will be a good example of indirect strategy as well, because military force is a component, not the decisive component. So Yasmin's comment is that what I've described essentially represents systemic effects of some of these operations by certain states against the target state. and they are long-term. For example, she mentioned Chinese influence through various means in Africa. I would agree with that. In fact, and also I would agree that the indirect strategy is not new. It's just that I'm wondering whether or not it's becoming more important in international security affairs nowadays, because the cost of direct clash, right, between the superpowers is still pretty much, nuclear-powered superpowers is still prohibitive, right? So states are not going to rationally engage one another directly through the main use of military power. They will seek other means to achieve their objectives. And what I tried to detail in this short presentation is to show that, you know, states can be very creative. You can try to control the back-end architecture of the internet. You can try to dominate the rare earth metals market, because those materials are so important in various strategic systems, right? You can try to build the telecommunications infrastructure of a particular country, for example, in Africa, right? And if you control and you build that telecommunications network, you can, you know, if needed, you can read all the emails and, you know, get access to all the information in the back end and through the back end, and that way shape the policy of the target state. So there are various means of achieving your goal of imposing your will on the target state without directly engaging the military force of the target state, the essence of indirect strategy.